They didn't just fire a CEO, they removed the soul of the company. In 1985, Steve Jobs walked out of Apple's headquarters, the company he had built in his parents' garage, with no power, no control, and no future inside it. The board believed they had saved Apple. They believed Jobs was too emotional, too reckless, too dangerous. Silicon Valley had rules. Founders were meant to start companies, then step aside. Steve Jobs refused. What followed wasn't just exile. It was humiliation, isolation, and a quiet belief spreading across the valley that Steve Jobs was finished. But what almost no one understood at the time was that removing Steve Jobs didn't fix Apple's problems. It created a much bigger one, because the very rule they fired him for breaking was the same rule Apple would later beg him to break again. And the moment Steve Jobs was pushed out of Apple was also the moment the countdown began to his return. Steve Jobs didn't grow up inside the system he would later challenge. Adopted at birth and raised by working-class parents, he never felt like he truly belonged. School bored him, authority frustrated him, and rules felt arbitrary. Even at a young age, Jobs was drawn not to how machines worked, but to how things felt to the people using them. He dropped out of college, drifted without a clear plan, and rejected the idea of a stable, predictable life, already positioning himself as someone fundamentally incompatible with conventional success. What drove Steve Jobs was not money or status, but a deep fear of irrelevance. Being adopted left him with a constant need to prove his worth, to create something so meaningful that it could never be ignored. Jobs believed mediocrity was a form of failure, and that belief shaped his obsession with perfection. He pushed himself and everyone around him to extremes, not out of cruelty, but out of terror that anything ordinary would erase his significance. Apple's early success masked growing internal chaos. As the company expanded, Jobs' lack of patience and refusal to compromise created friction with engineers, executives, and eventually the board. The Macintosh, meant to be his defining triumph, struggled commercially and costs spiraled out of control. Jobs blamed the world for not understanding his vision. But inside Apple, the narrative was changing. The founder was no longer seen as the future. He was becoming the problem. Faced with losing influence, Jobs made a critical choice. Instead of adapting to the corporate system, he tried to outmaneuver it. He attempted to undermine CEO John Sculley and reclaim control, believing vision mattered more than hierarchy. But Silicon Valley's rules were clear, and this time the system won. Jobs was stripped of authority, his team was dismantled, and at just 30 years old, he was effectively fired from the company he created, proving that founders who refuse to be replaceable will eventually be removed. Exile didn't free Steve Jobs, it followed him. He founded Next, a beautifully designed computer company that failed commercially, and purchased a struggling animation studio called Pixar when few believed in its future. Meanwhile, Apple without Jobs lost its identity and direction. Years later, desperate for survival, Apple acquired Next, bringing Jobs back quietly, not as a visionary hero, but as a necessity. From that moment, power slowly returned to him. Once back in control, Jobs ruled without compromise. He slashed projects, dissolved teams, and demanded absolute loyalty to the product. Inside Apple, innovation thrived alongside fear, and brilliance came at a human cost. Jobs believed greatness required sacrifice, and as Apple's influence grew, his circle shrank. Fewer people challenged him, fewer questioned his decisions, and the very traits that once got him fired now made him untouchable. Steve Jobs left behind a legacy that reshaped how the world interacts with technology, proving that emotion and design could redefine entire industries. He was fired for breaking Silicon Valley's rules, then invited back because no one else could break them successfully. Apple survived because Jobs returned, but it changed the world because he never learned to play by the rules. And the question remains unresolved. If Steve Jobs had followed the system, would Apple still exist? And if he had, would it have mattered at all?